I'll never forget the day Karen Wilson, HOA self-proclaimed queen, finally had it. I was fixing a sprinkler system in my front yard like I had done 100 times prior, when a blood-curdling scream cut through the stillness. "Help! 911 factorial, he's after me. He's threatening me." The voice was instantly familiar. Karen, the woman who had made my life hell ever since I moved into Oakwood Estates just 3 months earlier. But what happened next? That's where everything changed. I was paralyzed, rake in hand, bewildered by the commotion. In the distance, sirens were getting louder, ringing out through the neighborhood. Within seconds, 3 police cars skidded to a halt directly in front of my house. Officers leapt out, hands on guns, eyes fixed on me. "Sir, put down the garden implement and back away," one shouted, as another moved cautiously forward. Startled, I set the rake on the ground and held up my hands. Across the street, Karen stood in her immaculate flower bed, dramatically pointing at me like a scene from a courtroom drama. "That's him!" she exclaimed. "He was charging at me with that weapon." By then, it seemed my world had been turned upside down. How had I progressed from watering my lawn to being accused of a crime? I attempted to remain calm. "Officer, I don't have any idea what she's referring to. I've been repairing my sprinklers. I haven't even ventured out of my yard," I explained as consistently as I was able, even though my heart was pounding inside my chest. I could see the doubt in their eyes. That look I'd sadly seen before. Being a black man accused by a white woman in the suburbs didn't exactly work in my favor. But just when it seemed like things might spiral out of control, a lifeline appeared. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, stepped out of her house holding her phone. "Officers," she spoke softly but firmly, "I've been observing from my window the entire time. He never left his property. I taped everything when I saw Karen approaching to harass him again." The officers moved around her phone. The air was so charged with tension, you could sense it. Their faces changed as they viewed the video. First concern, then confusion, and then something akin to frustration. And so, slowly but surely, the tide shifted. Karen, feeling the shift, intensified her defiance. Her voice climbed in pitch and decibels. "He did threaten me. And he's violating at least 3 HOA landscape codes," she protested, almost frantically now. It was hardly the first time Karen had made my life miserable. Our rivalry started nearly as soon as I opened my final moving box. As HOA president, she used her power like a badge of honor and a club. During my first week, I returned home to discover a violation notice stuck to my front door. The transgression? My moving boxes were visible through the garage windows. 3 days after that, I received another. This time for my grass having grown a 1/4 inch too high on a business trip. And by week 3, that's when I knew Karen wasn't just diligent. She was fixated. She arrived with a measuring tape, informing me that my rose bushes were planted 2 inches past the permitted garden border outlined in Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the HOA rules. I attempted to be courteous. I attended the monthly HOA meetings, listened to her respectfully, and even modified my renovation plans to conform to each and every neighborhood visual regulation she referenced. But the harder I attempted to comply, the harder she pounced on me. And it wasn't only me, but that is a different story. Rumors of Karen's tyrannical grip on the neighborhood circulated in Oakwood Estates like a bad secret. Always there, never loud enough to challenge. Most people kept their heads down, too intimidated to say anything. After all, Karen's husband was a prominent local lawyer, and she never failed to remind everyone of the legal repercussions for the slightest violations of the HOA regulations. But I wasn't the only one to contend with her iron fist. I just happened to be the target. It all came to a head when I decided to change my yard to drought-resistant landscaping, an environmentally friendly HOA-sanctioned choice. I'd played by the rules, getting formal pre-approval from the architectural committee, but Karen wasn't cooperating. In her opinion, the specific color of decorative rock I'd chosen clashed with the visual harmony of the neighborhood. When I quietly submitted the approval documents, she refused to give up. Rather, she stormed off, complaining about loopholes and incompetence. After that, her fixation went into overdrive. The following day, I saw her outside my residence, taking pictures of my lawn from all sides. The next day, I could see her sitting in her car on the opposite side of the street, rudely chronicling my every step. I waved to ease the awkwardness. She took off speedily without a word. And then things really got weird. Suddenly, several neighbors received anonymous complaints from me allegedly making late-night noise disturbances. The strange thing? I typically get into bed by 10. My trash cans were somehow knocked out of position, winning me violation tickets. One afternoon, I returned from work to discover a ticket for having an unauthorized vehicle, because my cousin had stopped by for a short visit in his work van. It was clear Karen was responsible, but without concrete proof, my hands were tied. All I could do was continue to appeal the phony citations at each HOA meeting, where Karen ruled with that same self-satisfied authority. It all boiled over at one contentious HOA meeting. I finally had my say, not only about my case, but about the inconsistent enforcement of rules throughout the neighborhood. To my surprise, others began to pipe up. Homeowners who had remained silent for years began relating their own encounters with Karen. As more voices were raised, Karen's calm cracked. Seated at the head table, her face flushed with increasing intensity with each accusation. She suddenly adjourned the meeting 15 minutes early, under the guise of time constraints. At that moment, I knew. I had officially become enemy number one. The following morning settled the issue. At exactly 7 a.m., there she was, standing in front of my residence with a level and tape measure, taking the height of my brand new mailbox. That was the final straw. I figured it was time to put everything into writing. I placed security cameras throughout my property. I recorded every encounter. I kept my phone charged at all times, ready to capture any time I left the house. Gradually, others began to do the same. A silent resistance was brewing in Oakwood Estates. It began small, a few nods of encouragement as Karen paraded by with her clipboard. But it grew. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped by with cookies and muttered admonitions when Karen was sneaking around. Mr. Jenkins in the cul-de-sac down the street gave me a thick folder, his own stash of Karen encounters, going back 3 years, and that leads us to the day it all fell apart. I was out once more making some adjustments to my sprinkler system. Nothing out of the ordinary, only a couple of adjustments comfortably within the HOA's regulations. I spotted Karen standing in her window, holding her phone. I knew the drill, so I surreptitiously activated record and placed my phone on the ground, pointing directly at the sidewalk. She emerged from her house a few minutes later, sporting a forced smile plastered on her face. "Excuse me," she replied, her tone dripping in sugar-coated spite. "Those sprinkler heads are non-reg. HOA only allows Rainbird Pro Series. Brass finish." I breathed deeply. "Actually, Karen, those are the very same models specified in the HOA's landscaping manual. I can produce the paperwork if you'd care to see it." Her face contorted in rage, as if I had personally offended her. "Don't speak to me like that," she snapped. "I know all the words of those regulations. You're out of compliance. This is your last warning prior to fines and liens." I remained composed, though my anger was seething inside. "Karen, I've done everything by the book. Everything's been approved. What do you want from me specifically?" She took a step closer, poking her finger in the air toward my chest, careful not to actually touch me, but clearly communicating her point. "I want you folks to know that there are expectations in this community, expectations that were in place before you arrived." And there it was, the piece she'd avoided talking about for months, finally out. That sharp, all too familiar discomfort lodged in the pit of my stomach, one that appears only when racism manifests itself as a standards issue. But I held firm. I met her eyes and responded firmly. "I fully comprehend the standards, Karen. I also know harassment and discrimination," I said neutrally. "Now, unless you have a real violation to quote, with a reference bylaw, I'm going to return to my yard work." I went back to my sprinkler adjustment, making a conscious effort to be calm, effectively shutting her down. For a moment, the world was silent. Then out of the blue, Karen gasped, out loud. She whirled on her heels and ran for her house, already screaming into her phone. 911, help me! He's threatening me! He's chasing me with a weapon!" Her cries carried down the quiet street, breaking the tranquility like glass. I stood rooted, rake in hand, utterly shocked. I hadn't budged an inch. But Karen was acting out a role of a lifetime. Neighbors started venturing out, attracted by the stir. Mrs. Rodriguez began recording right away. Mr. Jenkins emerged with his tablet held high, already rolling. When the police showed up a few minutes later, at least half a dozen neighbors were recording the action from various vantage points. And that's when everything changed. As the officers arrived, Mrs. Rodriguez quickly presented them with her footage. One after another, neighbors came forward, each with a different video, all depicting the same thing. Karen had come up to me. Karen had started the confrontation. Karen had lied. The officers watched the footage in silence, their body language changing as the truth became apparent. Furrowed brows hardened. Their stance became rigid. When they finally went up to Karen, the mood had entirely reversed. "Ma'am," the lead officer, a tall woman with a clipped tone, said, "we need to talk about the call you just made." Karen launched into full dramatics. "He threatened me. I feared for my life. He had that garden tool and—" "Ma'am," the officer cut in, holding up a hand, "we've watched several videos. At no time did this man threaten you, come towards you, or behave in any way aggressively. In fact, you approached him, not vice versa, and you filed a false emergency report." Karen's color went white. "Those videos are edited. They don't depict everything. I know my rights." The officer's voice grew stern. "Ma'am, turn around. Put your hands behind your back." Karen's eyes went wide. "What? You can't be joking." "Karen Wilson," the officer said, now reading from a notepad, "you are being arrested for filing a false police report, abuse of emergency services, and making a false statement to a peace officer." The street grew quiet. Everyone stood by as Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA queen, was handcuffed in the middle of the road. Her expression ran from shock to anger to something else. Fear. "You'll be sorry," she yelled. "You know who my husband is? He's an attorney." But the officers didn't bat an eye, and for once, no one in Oakwood Estates turned a blind eye. 3 weeks earlier, I had sat in a courtroom and witnessed the ultimate downfall of her kingdom. The prosecution had constructed an airtight case, with video testimony, witness statements, and records of a pattern of similar events going back years. Karen's lawyer, interestingly not her husband, had attempted to make the case that she actually believed she was in danger, but the evidence told a different story. The judge, a gray-haired man with keen eyes and an even voice, looked over his glasses. "Mrs. Wilson," he asserted, "this court considers misrepresentations to emergency services a serious offense. These actions not only waste the public's scarce resources, but put actual victims at risk of being in a crisis situation." He took a moment before continuing. "Based on the overwhelming evidence, I find you guilty on all charges." Karen didn't move. She just stared ahead, eyes wide. "You are hereby sentenced to 6 months probation," the judge continued. "Fined $5,000 for misuse of emergency services, and ordered to complete 200 hours of community service at the County Crisis Center." Karen's composure cracked. An audible gasp escaped her lips. "And," the judge added, "you will also be responsible for court costs and emergency response fees totaling approximately $3,700. He shuffled his papers one last time. "This court also grants the restraining order sought by Mr. Taylor. You are to stay at least 100 feet away from him at all times, with no direct or indirect contact." Karen turned to her lawyer, whispering angrily, but he simply shook his head. And then, just as the judge was going on to the next case, my phone rang. It was an email from the HOA board. Emergency meeting called to address leadership concerns. 2 more emails arrived, then a third, from the board's vice president. "We'd like to formally ask if you would consider running for the now vacant position of HOA president." I glanced up from my phone and saw Karen being quietly comforted by her dwindling number of supporters. The Queen of Oakwood Estates, at last brought low. Her clipboard, her regulations, and her bullying reduced to ashes. And me? I just smiled. Because sometimes, the best way to win a war is to hit record.